World Refugee Council just this morning putting out an urgent call to action over the rapidly growing number of displaced people worldwide. The call is for major overhauls to the system that is meant to protect them. But the numbers are striking. 68.5 million people, nearly 70 million people listed as forcibly displaced in the world as of June of 2018. That's more than the number displaced by the Second World War. It is a crisis, and it's expected to get worse. Major political strife and climate change are some of the main culprits, and the situation is becoming more dire as developed countries close their borders to those seeking refuge. Lloyd Axworthy, certainly part of the Canadian story for many years, now heads the World Refugee Council, and as such, the person behind the report, which is coming out this morning, he's giving us some time in our New York bureau. And Mr. Axworthy, it's a pleasure to have you on the program again.
Thanks, Heather. Good to be here.
Thank you. Why don't you, we've been talking about this morning, but I'd like to hear you. 126 pages in this report. Could you sum up the crux of your call to action?
Well, I think it is to say we now have to move away just from the compassion and the rhetoric and the good sort of feelings to actually specific measures to do something about it. It's in that critical stage where, you know, the UN had a refugee compact. They worked hard at it. They got agreement from a number of countries. Now you have to translate that into something that actually is going to have a very tangible effect on the lives of refugees and the lives of the host governments who are absorbing millions of people at their own cost.
One of the issues at the core is, of course, money, the lack thereof. And one of the striking figures that we've been talking about from the report is that just 10 countries provide 75% of the UN budget to help refugees. So this report contains some very interesting, very creative financing mechanisms, one of which is to use the billions of dollars that are in frozen bank accounts of dictators in the world. How would that exactly work?
Well, Heather, to begin with, one of the fundamental weaknesses of the refugee system, it's dependent on donations, contributions. So it's like raising money for your spring prom. There's no continuity, there's no security in knowing that you can go forward, and therefore it's up and sort of like an in terms of available to help people in stress, but also to start reinvesting in development. So one of the things that we discovered during our discussions was the number of sort of piggy banks around the world that have been assembled by the bad guys, the warlords, the people who've been causing the conflicts, and the fact that it could be accessed, it could be reallocated. The Swiss have already taken some steps to have their own court system review whether these frozen assets could be redistributed to refugees, to other humanitarian purposes. That could release billions of dollars right now. And furthermore, it would provide a real deterrent to these characters who are responsible for the victimization of so many millions of people. And I think it would close off their impunity. They would all of a sudden realize that the piggy bank isn't there anymore, and it may provide a real deterrent for continued action. So it's actually a double whammy, both to find new funds, but also to deter some of the actions that are creating these very large numbers of refugees.
It's striking. I mean, Venezuelan assets for Nicolas Maduro, $3 billion seized in the United States. Syrian assets, of course, frozen in the U.S. and in the EU. And you're talking about $10 to $20 billion that you could access and redeploy to the people who have been hurt by these very same dictators.
Right.
That's a huge sum of money.
And maybe more, Heather. I mean, that's just an estimate that we received from the World Bank. But there's some really interesting forensic work going on by various think tanks and others to determine where the money goes. You know, it's the old political science axiom, follow the money. And I think that this is one of the ways in which we can help sort of restart a reform of the system by saying there's a way of really doing almost a morality play, getting the bad guys finally to pay for the people they've victimized. And therefore, all we need is several governments to combine and work together, create a critical mass, and all of a sudden you'll start changing the whole financial setup for, particularly for the development in places where large numbers of refugees have settled, to provide jobs and employment and healthcare, those kinds of things.
So let's look to the reality in some of those countries, because so many countries are either have or are contemplating closing their doors to the migrants who show up on their shores. One of the issues that we're talking about, I mean, just today, you take a look at Italy. Italy just evicted this week more than 500 people from a refugee center. And you have the de facto leader there, Matteo Salvini, saying, yes, I did that, essentially shrugging off any criticism of the hard line that we're seeing him take.
Sure.
You have Donald Trump, of course, his stance against people arriving in the United States. It's all very well to talk about this, and yet, in this climate of populism and closed borders and closed doors, what sort of appetite is there internationally to make the kind of transformational change you're talking about?
Well, Heather, you know, the one thing that we found in the year and a half that we've been visiting the front lines and talking to such a wide range of people about their concerns, there's a lot of interesting, good work going on out there. The UN is doing some good work. NGOs are doing it. It's just that it is being pushed back by this, as you describe it, this kind of populist political issue. You know, but I'm of the opinion, and as you know, I spent a lot of years as a street politician in Canada, that the way to overcome that is to actually do things. If people can see that governments are managing large flows of people, that there's a way of doing it so that it's not disruptive and displacing, then I think you begin to counter the arguments of the right wing on this issue and reduce the ability to exploit people's emotions and fears. And that's the biggest issue. So much of this is just a perception that's been generated, when in fact what we know in reality is that refugee movements can be a huge contribution. I was an immigration minister back in the other Mr. Trudeau's government when we had the boat people coming in, and now we're getting reports of just how much of a contribution they've made to Canada. So I think that it's changing that narrative, which is also an important reason for putting this report out for discussion and debate, and we hope real action.
And I know you'll be doing so later today there at the UN, and talking of the consequences if these kinds of recommendations aren't followed. So we will have further coverage of your report to come today. But before I let you go, you mentioned Immigration Minister. Can I get you to put on another former cabinet minister's hat, and that is that of Foreign Affairs Minister? Because we're following today as well very closely Venezuela and the story of two men claiming to be president, this political crisis. But you have Canada immediately saying that, in fact, Juan Guaido is the legitimate president of Venezuela now, despite the fact that Nicolas Maduro isn't going anywhere. And I'm just wondering, as you watch that from a foreign affairs perspective, what can and should Canada be doing on Venezuela right now?
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 things. One is that we really have to help support the massive refugee flow. People coming across the Venezuelan border into Colombia, and it's affecting 5 or 6 other countries, and instability. Plus there's really horrible sexual abuse going on at the border because there's no security there. I think we need to help the international community, the OAS or others, to provide some framing of what's going on. But what we also heard when we were down in Colombia at the end of August, that there needs to be a regional response. Right now it's very fragmented, and I think the whole idea is that there's got to be that region has to really take some real control of what's going on. Otherwise they're just going to be overwhelmed by the surge of people and the instability that's going on. So I think Canada, again, as a good hemispheric neighbor, should be very much involved in helping to organize that kind of international regional response.
Lloyd Axworthy, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program and to hear your perspective on these world matters. Thank you for today.
Thank you very much, Heather. Good to be here.